Hi, I'm Elaine Jabenis, and I want to tell you a little something about myself. I think I need to go back to where my parents came from. My father, Saul Lagman, came from Russia. My mother, Ida, came from Russia. My father came over here when he was a teenager, and my mother was born here. Now, they lived for a lot of years in South Omaha. That is, my mother did. And my father went into the Army for World War One. And I remember when she was very ill with the flu. You remember there was a terrible epidemic of flu during that time, of 1917, I believe it was, and people were dying right and left. But he was so in love with her that he came and sat by her bedside, even though he was in danger of maybe catching that very dangerous flu. So consequently and happily, of course, they both recovered and everything was fine, and they were married. And she had, my mother and father had 3 children. I was the oldest. My sister Diana was the second, and my brother Jordan was the third. Now, my mother and dad were in the grocery business, and back in those days, they did mom and pop stores, and they worked side by side and really struggled in those days. We lived above the store. That was so typical during that period, too. And finally, they were able to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. And then my father opened 2 more stores and was doing quite well. And we moved into a wonderful house. And he was raising his family. My brother went off when he grew up to California. My sister married Norman Hahn during World War II, and I married Mace Jabenis during World War II. Now, Mace came from Kansas City, and I think you might like to know how we met. Well, I was a bridesmaid in a wedding in Kansas City to a young woman whose name was Sarah Clerman. That was her married name, actually. And I met Mace at the wedding. He was a groomsman, and I was a bridesmaid. And the first thing he did was to step on my dress and tear it. And that got us off to a wonderful start. I didn't like him very much. And so we tried to get through the evening as nicely as we could. And as the evening went on, we became a little bit more friendly. But I still was not enamored with him. So it went on for about 4 years when we were off and on and friendly or not friendly. And actually, I was going with someone else in Omaha because he was in Kansas City, you understand. And one day he heard that I got engaged. And the fellows in his fraternity tried to console him because they knew how he felt about me. And he felt that it was all over. Well, as it turned out, I was really not engaged. I was just dating this guy. So when he heard that I was still available, maybe a year later, he contacted me. And he was now in uniform. So we were not in a position to do anything about a relationship. It still was a long-distance relationship. And then he went off to the Air Force. He was in the Air Transport Command. He crossed the Atlantic 84 times, which was really remarkable record. But that, of course, was all part of his service after we were married. We met in Chicago at the Palmer House. And I remember he got down on his knee and he asked me to marry him. And he had leave for 3 weeks. Now that meant that my parents had to get a wedding together in 3 weeks. Well, I think during the war there was a lot of that going on. And we got married at the Blackstone Hotel. And we got married in the Orleans Room because they were refurbishing it at that time, and it was not a restaurant yet. So that was the room in which we were married, and then we left for New York That's where our honeymoon was, because he was attached to the Air Transport Command and he was attached to LaGuardia Field. So he brought his bride to New York. We found a place to live it was in Flushings, and it was a kind of an old, beautiful old house that had been turned into a rooming house, and that's where a lot of service people were living. And he dropped his bride and flew across the ocean and was gone for, I think, on that trip for 3 weeks. So I had a little time by myself to get acquainted with New York, but I was really kind of frightened because I'd never been there before, ever. But I loved New York almost immediately. So when he got back, I said that I thought I had to get a job because he was going to be gone a long time, off and on. He was like home a week and gone 3. So I needed to have something to do. So what I did is I went down to Manhattan one day, and oh, Manhattan with all its glory and glamour, and the big Times building where the sign was going around, gave you the news every day, and that big sign with Camel cigarettes where the smoke was coming out of somebody's mouth. They don't have that anymore because I think cigarette advertisements of that kind have been abolished. But it was very exciting for me, and I looked up at all these wonderful buildings and I said, I belong here. So I walked into the New York Times building. By the way, I forgot to mention that while I was in high school, I was the Omaha World Herald correspondent for the Central High Register. I was a city editor on the Central High Register, and I had a teacher there, Elaine Savage, who told me, Elaine, you can write. You should pursue this. So I had this file back in the back of my head. So when I got to New York and I went into the New York Times building just to be near the great New York Times, it started to pour just buckets. And it looked like it wasn't going to stop for a long time. So I was standing in the lobby and I thought, it's kind of boring just standing in the lobby. So I went and looked on the monitor of the directory to see where things were, and it said there New York Times personnel office, and I thought, hey, what the heck, I think I'll just go up there and see somebody. I really didn't believe that I was going to get a job at the New York Times. I was just doing this as a lark. So when I got into the elevator, I told the elevator operator, they were not automatic then, that I would like to go up to the 11th floor. The 11th floor. Okay, that's where personnel was. So I went up to the 11th floor and I walked into the personnel office and I said, I'd like an application. I'd like to apply for a job. Now, I was like 20 years old or so, and I think the person at the desk looked at me and just sort of smiled compassionately and just said, okay, handed me this application. And I sat down at the desk, filled it out, and I want you to know that that is the best piece of fiction I have ever written. I made up such a resume of experience that no one could believe, not even me. But I was kind of having fun doing it because this was just a lark. There's no way in the world I would get a job at the New York Times. So I filled this whole thing out, and I said that I worked for the World Herald, and I've written this, and I've written that, and I've had articles printed. I had a couple little things printed, but they weren't anything of any consequence. So I handed it back to the person at the desk, and she looked it over, and I could just see her laughing as she'd read it, and she said, thanks very much, and she put it into a file, stacks of files, put it up on top, and thanked me and said I could leave. So I went back to the elevator and was hoping that the rain had stopped. Up there, I could not tell. I was waiting for the elevator, and most of the New York Times elevators do not all go to the 11th floor. So there were only 3 there, I think, and I thought they would never come. Well, they didn't come, because right now comes a man, and I found out later his name was Harry Tootle. Harry Tootle was the personnel director. They didn't call it human relations back then, they called it personnel. And he had my application in his hand, would you believe? And he said, are you Elaine Jabenis? Oh, yes. And I said, yes, sir. And he said, well, it says here that you've had secretarial experience and that you worked for the Omaha World Herald. I said, yes. He said, well, Mrs. Sulzberger, whose father owned the New York Times and whose husband was now the publisher, Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, had a secretary who was just taken to the hospital with an appendectomy. And I wondered if you would fill in for a couple, 3 weeks. Because back then, an appendectomy meant you were flat on your back for 3 weeks. Now that you're up in 4 or 5 days, I guess. But she was going to be gone for a while. So I thought, oh my God, just to be on the payroll of the New York Times for 2 or 3 weeks would be wonderful. And wouldn't that look good on my resume? So I said, yes, absolutely. He says, so when can you start? I said, now. And he says, all right, I will take you down there. So he did. And I met Mrs. Sulzberger's secretary. He had this wonderful plush office. After all, she was the owner of the new famous New York Times. Can you believe this? This little hick from Omaha, Nebraska, walking into that office. Well, I just, was kind of shy and didn't have much to say. And so she said, she gave me a few things to do. And really mostly just answering the phone and directing messages to whoever they were calling. But most everything had to go through her. Nobody could get through to Mrs. Sulzberger without going through her. So that's what we did. Then after about the second week of doing literally nothing, and I had a desk and everything, I saw they had a supply cabinet, big supply cabinet, that was kind of messy. And I thought, may I just straighten this up? So I just wanted to keep busy. It was getting kind of boring. She said, sure. So I got down on my hands and knees and I cleaned that place up. I cleaned everything out and put it all back in and got it all arranged. It was just, very, very special. And then the day came, I had my last day at the New York Times. And Mrs. Sulzberger came out of her office and she turned to me and she said, Elaine, I understand this is your last day. And I said, yes, ma'am, it's my last day. She says, what are you going to do now? I said, look for a job. She said, from what I hear, a young lady is as resourceful as you are. Certainly in this organization, we should be able to find you a job. And I said, well, that would be great. And she called Mr. Tootle on the phone, and she says, Mr. Tootle, don't you suppose we can find a job for this young woman? And I'd like you to come down to the office and see what you could do. Well, that was a command, And he was down there in seconds, and he got me a job. And I was there for 3. I'd like to talk a little bit about my days or my 3 years at the New York Times, because they were very impressionable times, and they did a lot to form my future. So my first job at the New York Times outside of Mrs. Sulzberger's office was with the education editor. Now, I was kind of a gopher and kind of worked into be a little bit of an assistant, and then after a while, he let me do some editing, let me read some copy. He was very generous in trying to teach me. He knew I wanted to write. So he did try to teach me. And his name was Benjamin Fine. He was the Pulitzer Prize winner. And he later, when I wrote my first book, wrote the foreword for my first book. And that was a real thrill for me to have a Pulitzer Prize winner from the New York Times write the foreword for my book, which was the first I'd ever had published. But going back to Benjamin Fine, he told me to write 1 million words and then come back and tell me that I'm ready to be a writer. So I realized that you just don't suddenly become a writer. You say, I want to be a writer, and then just start writing. Because you can write some stuff, but you can't write anything really, really good, and you can't write anything that's really saleable until you really know what it means to let that written word come forward and draw pictures, create a story, make it a good read, and all of that I learned from Benjamin Fine. Now, after that, I was moved to, I worked for the financial editor, I worked for the automobile editor. New York Times had very various divisions. Then I worked for the drama critic, Brooks Atkinson. Now that was really a thrill. I don't really know how I was so fortunate to get into these various areas, being as inexperienced as I really was, except that a couple of people liked me and just felt that I was sincere and really wanted to learn. And actually, they didn't really like women in the city room. At that particular time, in the 1940s, early 1940s, women were not very well received at the New York Times as reporters. Those that were really kind of brushed aside and had to work awfully hard to make it. One particularly for whom I got acquainted was Virginia Pope, who was the head of the fashion department. Now, I had no interest in fashion, really. I always loved it. I always enjoyed seeing clothes, wearing clothes, that kind. But I never really knew a lot about the business of fashion. Virginia Pope taught me that. She put on these magnificent fashion shows at the Times Hall, which Mrs. Sulzberger was responsible for. And they are to this day, have twice a year huge fashion sections, pull-out sections like a magazine that cover the fashion industry. New York is the leading fashion capital of this country and has fast became the leading capital of fashion as far as sportswear is concerned in the world. Paris and Italy were still the leaders, and London, but when it came to sportswear, nobody could make them like the Americans could. So that was a thrill and an education. Then I worked for, I was brought in to the managing editor's office. Now that is the city room itself. This great big city room is where all the action is. Behind a gate was where the managing editor sat with his two assistants, one of which was me eventually. One was the news desk, the wire service, where things were coming off the wire. Across that little fence was the city editor. The city editor took care of everything that was happening in New York. The rest of the room is huge, with desks lined up like soldiers, one after the other in lines, all across that room, everyone with telephones on them, everyone with typewriters on them. And then that was a time when you saw the old-fashioned newsroom that was really clicking. And the New York Times newsroom was really something to experience. I will never forget when I walked in there the first time and all these people walking around and the phones ringing and the typewriters clicking and just so much action. The high energy almost was overwhelming. I almost, took my breath away. But I felt at home in it for some reason or other. That was my place. And I worked for Turner Catledge, who was the managing editor of the New York Times for almost 2.5 years. I was with him. For some reason or other, he and I got along fine. And he taught me. I knew very little. But this is where women belonged, as kind of administrative assistants. But by being this and learning so much from them, I became very knowledgeable about the newspaper business, big league. And that was the big league, totally. I met Pulitzer Prize winners, people that stood there and were waiting to hear off the wire service, which was right near my desk, when they announced the winners for that particular year. Nobel Prize winners, and it came off the wire. As it came off, it was going right to the newsroom, right to the press room. That to me was an experience I will never ever be able to replace, and God only knows how I got into that. But you know what that showed me? It showed me that it isn't always who you know. It isn't always what you know. It has a lot to do with some kind of divine guidance. I really believe that there was some kind of a little angel that sat on my shoulder and was always just taking me wherever I needed to be. And I just followed, fell in spot, in this to the spot, and took off with it. Now, if I had planned that, if I ever said, when I get to New York, I'm going to go work for the New York Times, and I'm going to work for the managing editor, and I'm going to have a Pulitzer Prize winner write a foreword for my book, I never could have had it happen. But that isn't the way life works. I think life works the way you just take it one step at a time, and like Benjamin Fine taught me, book is written one word at a time. A song is written one note at a time. And I think that's what has worked for me all of that time. After the war was over, I stayed on because I loved New York and I thought I had a wonderful opportunity there. In fact, the managing editor told me that it was time for me to start going on calls with some of the reporters. I went with reporters on interviews. I went to an interview with the movie editor, and we went. I remember I had a picture of this that appeared in one of the stories that was written about me. To interview Rex Harrison at the Stork Club, and that was extremely exciting. I don't know how that happened either. Now here comes another story that blows my mind. Shortly after that, I got a call from a movie producer who wanted to know if they could do a screen test of me. And I thought, this has got to be some kind of a joke. So I said, oh yeah. And they said, we'll be in to see you at the Times. They weren't asking me to meet them anywhere or anything. We'll come in to see you. If you mind if I come over like 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, whatever it was, I don't remember. They came, and I think it was Paramount Studios. I can't remember for sure. That is not to be taken as a final word, but I think it was Paramount. Anyway, they talked to me, and I said, I've had no theatrical experience. And they said, well, we talked to someone who talked to you and loved your voice. So he said, and liked your look. And we wondered if you would consent to do this. I said, well, I need to talk to my husband about that. So then I went immediately to the motion picture editor, who is Bosley Crowther, brilliant man, very famous. And he sat me down and he said, Elaine, I want to level with you. He said, you do not have a killer instinct. I would urge you not to do this. He says, I'm not saying that you couldn't do an effective, test, but he said, you probably could. He said, but I would advise you not to do it. He said, that is a snake pit. You would not be married, and I was just a bride, very long. He says, and he says, you haven't got a killer instinct. He says, I don't think you've got the temperament to do it. So I decided not to. After I'd just been married a short time, I was very much in love with my husband. I really didn't want to disrupt that. I'd already been doing so much at the New York Times. I was afraid it was taking too much away from us. So I said no. And that was the end of that story. So shortly after that, Mace and I returned to Omaha. He hated New York. He worked there for a while just to appease me, but it was not a good place for him. And so we decided to come back to Omaha, and that's where we made our home. Okay. You know, I'd like to go do a little flashback like they do in books, because I left out everything about my father's family and my mother's family, and I kind of would like to fill you in on all of that too. I think earlier I said that my mother was born in the United States. I think that's a mistake. I think my aunt, her younger sister, Rosalie, was born here, and mother was born in Russia. But she came over as she was either 1 or 2 or 3 years old. That was as old as she was. I know she was just a baby. So she was born in Russia. My Aunt Rosalie was born in the United States. Now, my father had 3 brothers and 3 sisters. They all came to Omaha eventually. Then they all left eventually, with the exception of my father. My father and his older brother opened up a grocery store on 33rd Street, and I don't remember exactly where, but 33rd near Franklin, I think it was. And they were in business together for a couple of years before my Uncle Jake, which is the older brother, moved away, and my dad went into the grocery business on his own. Now, his 3 sisters married. One went to Chicago with his Aunt Fanny. My Aunt Mossy, went to Newark, New Jersey. And the other sister died very young. She was in Omaha, but died young. The other brother, Carl, the younger brother, stayed in Omaha. I'm sorry, he did not leave town. See, I'm trying to get this all put together, trying to remember all of this stuff, so I am making a few mistakes, but I will correct him as I go along. Uncle Carl stayed here, and he had a hardware store, and down on about 16th Street. He stayed in that hardware store until he retired. My Aunt Fanny, whom he married, worked for the city, and she kept working until she retired, and they both stayed in Omaha. Both eventually ended up in the Bloomkin home. My Aunt Fanny died first. My Uncle Carl was the last brother to go. He was the youngest. He lived to be 98. My father died at 92. His brother Jake died at 92. And the 3 girls all died younger, which is amazing because usually women live longer than men, but in this family, the men lived longer, and the women all died in their 60s, and one, I believe, in her 70s. So they did not live very long. My grandfather, Herman, who lived in South Omaha, had a furniture store. What a salty old guy he was. He had red hair, and he had a temperament to go with it. He was so much fun, but he was a stubborn son of a gun. And he finally got out of the furniture business after he managed to run it down into the ground. This furniture store was on 24th Street in South Omaha. He was not a businessman, but he was really a living doll. And after he got out of the furniture business, he supposedly retired. He lived to be 74. 77, and my grandmother, his wife, Molly, lived to be 74. She had a family of 14 siblings. They all were from Russia, and I don't believe she was able to continue her life with very many of them. Most of them stayed there. Some of them died or were killed in the pogroms. One part of the family were the Singers, who lived also in South Omaha, who eventually went to California. One became a doctor. 2 of them became doctors. One still lives in California. Herbie Singer. His older brother lived in Illinois and then moved to California. It goes on and on. It's very hard to keep track of all of these people, but they were a wonderful family who pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and did very well. Then, when I was in grade school, let's start with that, okay? While we're getting on to me. I went to Franklin School. In Franklin School, I really was a lost soul. I was a poet, and poets do not fit in well. I remember someone saying that Hubert Humphrey was a poet, and poets never win because they're much too romantic, much too pragmatic, much too sweet, maybe, and not tough-nosed enough. But I don't know about me being sweet, but I was poetic, and I was kind of off somewhere. My mother used to say I was a daydreamer. She had labels for us kids, which I didn't think was very fair. She called me a daydreamer. She called my sister a balabusta because she was always cooking, worked in the store. I never was interested in the store. And my brother, she called him the spoiled one. And who spoiled him? Mom and Dad. Because he was the only boy and he was the baby, and that's what happened with him. But he wasn't really all that spoiled. He turned out to be one hell of a sweet guy. Now, in grade school, forgive me if I'm digressing, but these are the way the thoughts come. In grade school, I was very out of step. I marched to an entirely different drummer. I preferred to write poems when I sat at my desk, and everybody else was doing all the usual things that kids do. So I was not very happy in grade school. I was kind of out of step and not a part of the group. But I somehow managed to, through the things that I felt and the things that I was feeling inside of me, to create this person that I was to become. When I got to high school, I wasn't exactly in step either, except there was the opportunity to do the things that was more suitable, things that were more suitable for me. I got on the Central High Register, which was a place to write. I became a reporter, then I became a city editor, and I met this wonderful teacher, Elaine Savage, who encouraged me. There was also the Central High Players, where theater began to expose itself to me. And when it came to the senior play, guess what I was? I was a costume, on the costume committee. I never got cast. For some reason or other, I wasn't suitable for any of the parts, but it was okay because I got acquainted with what it was like to be backstage and what it was like to be in theater, and just the smell of it, the smell of the grease paint, as they say, was something that I loved. So I've discovered a new love, and that's what high school actually did for me. Then my teacher said that I should go to the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern. Well, we actually could not afford to send me to school at Medill, at Northwestern. But I did get a chance through the school to go to the Medill School of Journalism for this particular seminar, or weekly. It was about 6 weeks, I think. And I really began to feel that I was understanding a little more about what it was like to be a writer. I knew it was not going to be easy, but easy was of no interest to me at the time. Just wanted to write. So I would write, and some of my friends with whom I grew up with, Charlotte Nogg, Charlotte Slutsky, often said that she remembered when we had sleepovers, when we were kids at school, I always had a script under my pillow. And I really didn't remember that, but she said I was writing all the time. And I guess I was. I was always making notes and had pads and things tucked on, and I would write stories, and God knows whatever happened with those stories. I never thought they were any good, and in most cases I just threw them away. Then I sold a story to the Omaha World Herald, would you believe, a short story. Back then, they were printing stories from freelance writers. And I think I got a big fee of $10, maybe 15 at the most. Huge. I thought it was fantastic. Anyway, it was called A Great Story, spelled Grate. It was a story about a girl who got her heel caught in a grate, and that's how she met somebody very special. So The Great Story was my first published short story in the Omaha World Herald. I have to do another little flashback for you about what it was like to go to the synagogue when I was a kid. We went to the old synagogue, and I just cannot remember where it was located right now, but I remember that the women sat upstairs and the men sat downstairs, and we were about as serious about going to the synagogue as going to having recess at school. I would sit there for a while because my parents would like me to be, at least my mother and the other women in the family want me to stay there for a while. And then after a while, the ho-hum thing with the kids, whenever there was a break, we would go outside and we would be cluttered around the steps. There were steps going down to the street, and we always would stand out on the steps and talk and have fun and whatever and carry on. And it was extremely important to be very nicely dressed. And everybody wore their best new clothes, and we always were kind of looking over what everybody else wore and how we felt about what we wore. And I always felt that mine was never as good as so-and-so's dress. And but I imagine the other girls felt the same way too. I think those are the tough things. That's the tough things that kids went through. That was the most painful thing for me, was trying to measure myself up to some of the other girls, particularly the ones that seemed to have all the money, when we were really very, very, not really, we're poor, but very moderately, very middle class. And I just, used to feel like I was really not dressed properly. I just wondered if that had an influence on me later when I began to wonder about the importance of clothes. And I carried that on into my work when I eventually went to work for Brandeis. I wouldn't be a bit surprised, and you want to know the truth, that thought never occurred to me until just now as I started talking about it. And I think that as we start examining the things that go on in our life, we begin to realize that those things that happened along the way had an impact on what was to happen later, what was going to happen in days to come. And I really feel that everything we did of any importance had made a contribution, good or bad, to what we did later. So high holidays meant hanging out on the steps of the synagogue, and then on Rosh Hashanah, getting together at a family's house for lunch, and for Yom Kippur, it was going to break the fast at one of my aunts or uncle's house for when we broke the fast for Yom Kippur. And those were always good times because there was wonderful food and everybody was having a good time, and it just seemed to feel very free and easy, and didn't seem to be a lot of restriction on behavior. We could just do pretty much what we wanted. So I enjoyed the holidays because they were just, to me, were just get together with friends and get together with family. From a religious point of view, I'm sorry to just say that I really soaked up very little, except that I knew that this was a day, a time that we must go to the synagogue. And that, of course, carried it over. I carried it over when I became an adult. I carried it over with my children. And thank God they're carrying it over with my grandchildren. But the seeds were spread, and it was a beginning. I don't know that we ever did, that I ever cared much for Friday night services. We would go as often as we could. My folks had a store and both worked hard and sometimes were open late. But Friday night services, Saturday morning services, We would go usually when there was a bat mitzvah or a bar mitzvah. No bat mitzvah. When I was growing up, I never had a bat mitzvah because the women, girls, did not have bat mitzvahs in those days. So I was just confirmed. There was not that wonderful thing available to us. When my daughter grew up, she had a bat mitzvah. So that was something that was corrected on the side for women as we went along, and a very good thing. I want to tell you about what it was like when Mace and I first came back to Omaha after we left New York. But I failed to tell you that when I went to New York with Mace, we went on a train, and I think it took us 2 days to get there. We were not flying at that time, and commercial flight, as we know it today, did not really exist for the average traveler. Sure, we had a lot of flying going on in the war, but these were warplanes. These were not commercials. So we went to New York on a train, and we came back from New York on a train. Now we left New York because Mace did not like New York, and I agreed that this probably would not be the best place to raise children. So we came back to Omaha. Now you may wonder why we came back to Omaha rather than going to Kansas City, because Mace was from Kansas City. He's not an Omahan. Well, his brother, who was also from Kansas City, got married and moved to Omaha, the older brother, and he wanted to go into the luggage business. He had worked in a luggage factory when he was in Kansas City, and wanted to go in the luggage business and wanted Mace to go in with him. So it was agreed they would both open a luggage factory in Omaha and make luggage. So that's what they did. And when they started out on a shoestring. We lived with my folks at their home on 38th and Franklin, 3836 Franklin. And the house was built such that it made it quite nice for another couple to live in there, because the entire upper level was ours, and it was quite large, and we had that to ourselves. And the lower level, which was a ranch type, where everything was on that level, that's where my folks were. So we were there for, I think, I would say 2 or 3 years, maybe. My first child, when my son was born, we were still there, and then we moved out shortly after that. But they went into the luggage business downtown, and they worked so hard. 2 young guys working on a shoestring, opened up a factory, traveled all over the state to find the kind of machinery they needed. They went to Kansas City and imported machinery, went to New York, went to Philadelphia to buy supplies, buy equipment, to buy raw materials, and finally gathered it all together. And it took them the first 2 or 3 years to get this thing rolling. And it was a struggle, but it was a labor of love. It was step by step, one agonizing step by step. And we had a big green truck with a big flatbed behind. That's the only car we had between the 2 families, between Mace's family and his brother Eli. And 1 week they would get the green truck, and 1 week we would get the green truck for social purposes. And that's what we did. We drove around town in a big old green truck. Now today you probably would have died to having to done that. But it didn't bother me then. I was just tickled to death when it was our week. And that was a week we could get around and do something, go to a movie or go grocery shopping or do whatever we need to do. The week that we didn't have a car, we didn't have anything. Fortunately, we were living with my father and mother, who at the time had a grocery store, and they did the grocery shopping and brought the groceries home. But that's the way we started. And I sometimes think about that green truck as being a go light. Green for go. and we went after it the hard way, and we did it. And Eli moved from one building to another, moved to another building from the first one that they had, and expanded a little bit and started selling their suitcases all over the state of Nebraska, Iowa, all this area. And then their first big break came is when Sears offered them a contract to make certain cases for them, and they thought the world had dropped into their lap. It was very exciting. Then they found out that was not a very good deal, because Sears wanted to take over their entire production, and by so doing, that would mean that if Sears pulled out at the end of their contract, they would be left with no customers at all. So it took a lot of courage and a lot of bravery for them to go to Sears and say no. Can you imagine having to do that? They had to do that because it was well known that big companies take over factories, and then when they pull out, the factories fold. So they took the big leap and decided to stick with building their own clientele, their own customer base, by just going to all the companies available to them throughout the area. Then, let's see, we moved out of my folks' home, and we moved into an apartment on 39th and Davenport. Now, at 39th and Davenport, we lived in a duplex on the upper level, and I thought that was just heaven. It was a marvelous apartment. It had a study and a living room and 2 bedrooms, a bath, and a kitchen. Now that was a pretty good size, and the rooms were a pretty nice size. That was a pretty good size for a first what we thought would be a little apartment. It was a pretty good size. And it was right across the street, would you believe, from the old community playhouse. There again, see, it seems that I was always placed somewhere where I was to move in some kind of direction. And I would see the playhouse across the street. And from the New York Times, when I worked for the Drama Critic, there were moments when I would go to it every first night that opened on Broadway when I worked for Brooks Atkinson, who was such a famous reviewer for the New York Times, that they named a theater after him. The Brooks Atkinson Theater, to this day, is a very good, very prominent theater on Broadway. And he was the most feared reviewer in the country. And if Brooks Atkinson put his stamp on a play, it would run forever and it would be a huge success. If Brooks Atkinson put a stamp of disapproval on it, it could close in 3 days. And that happened very often. Now, he might have been considered a villain, but to me, he was an absolute genius. This man was so sweet. He said to me that I always go to the theater with stars in my eyes. I want to see genius. I want to see success. I want to praise. And he says, and when I don't see it, and when I see that able people come across with mediocre work, or even less than mediocre, I feel I've got to say so. And he was a man of high integrity. Though he was feared, he was a man of integrity. Taught me something. Don't say anything that's damaging to anyone unless there's a very, very good reason. Always say something good if there's something good to be said, because that is what you must do. That is a personal responsibility of everyone. I would hope that my children and grandchildren will always do that. I hope my friends or anyone who sees this always say good things, always pump up other people. Always give them the courage to move on, because that is a part of the responsibility of being part of their lives, just as others were part of mine. What they did for me, I hope I can do for them, and so on. And carry that torch on for the good, and try not to think of the negative. Dispel that wherever you can. I really believe that, and I think we should jump to another place now that I don't want to miss out on. It's when I started working in radio. When I got back from New York, I wanted to go to work right away. Of course, I didn't have a baby yet, and so I went to a WW radio to write continuity. That meant to write commercials and to write material for those people who were on the air. I loved doing that for a while. I wrote the continuity and would hand the commercials. They would give me the material. I would write the commercials. We had a certain amount of words we could use and a certain amount of time. Oh, by the way, we could go over time at that particular time. If a minute commercial ran a minute 15 or a minute 20, it was okay. We could do that. They were not very strict about keeping it right down to the second or down to the minute. So we were not tied down too much, so we could just ramble on a little bit. I did that for a while, and then along came a client, which is Shaver's grocery store. And Joe Shaver, who was the man who owned the store, wanted a commercial that he felt would set him aside from the chain stores. This was a family-owned business. So I wrote this commercial, and they said, Elaine, I want you to put it on tape so we can make the presentation. And just read it off for us. I said, okay. So I did, and they put it on tape. And I think it was reel-to-reel tape. I'm not sure, but it was on a disc, but it was not, cassette. It was on a disc or reel-to-reel. Anyway, they presented it to Mr. Shaver, and he said he liked it very much. So they said, fine, we will get you a contract, and put this on the air, and we will give you a tape of the man who will do the commercial. He says, no, that's not what I said. I don't want someone else to do the commercial. I want that lady to do the commercial, whoever that was. I like her voice, so I'd like her to do the commercial. And they said, oh, she's not an announcer. She's not an on-the-air personality. She just writes continuity for us. He said, I don't care. He said, that's the voice I want. So he's a client. Customer's always right. So they came back and told me, and I said, oh, that's nice. So I started recording commercials for Joe Shaver, and he, I have to thank, for the one who got me on the air. I began doing commercials for him, and the next thing I know, someone asked me if I would like to write a concept for a show to go on the air on weekends. And I said, sure. So I thought about it, and I wrote a thing called the Saturday Scrapbook. That was the day I aired it, and I was to be started with 15 minutes, and I had an announcer called Ray Olson who had the most beautiful voice on the air, and he was my partner, and we did this conversation back and forth, and we had music, we had special poems that I would read, we would have topics we would discuss, we would sometimes interview people. This was perhaps the first talk show that I was connected with, or that maybe the station had up to that particular time. Well, Saturday Scrapbook became so popular that it was given a full place on the schedule, and I began having ads in the paper about the show and in the bulletins that they sent out and whatever. And once in a while I had a guy substitute for Ray if he was off. It was a guy that was new at the station. His name was Johnny Carson. And it was kind of fun having him on it, but he was so unpredictable that I just, didn't know where it was going to go. And it got to be such a thing that I just had to be flexible, because what we scripted and what we said was not exactly the way it was planned, but it really came off quite well. Then, as time went on, I got pregnant with my first child. And I was still on the air. There was no problem with that, with radio. You could still perform. Later, on television, there was not a lot in those days for people who were pregnant to be on the air. But radio was not a problem. So I was on the air until I was on a week before I was to deliver. And Johnny Carson took over my show while I was gone, while I had the baby, and while I had a leave of absence. And you know that he took my talent fee. We got paid per show. He took my talent fee because he needed the money. And I remember once when he did a show with me, he borrowed 60 cents from me for lunch because he didn't have any money. And I reminded him years later that he never paid me back. And he says, well, just put it on my bill. Bless his heart. He was always great for a laugh. Well, while I was at the station, we became good friends. Those of us who were on the air really had a camaraderie which was so very special. So one New Year's Eve, I decided to have New Year's Eve party in our duplex. I invited everybody in the station, particularly all the on-the-air people, engineers,